And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather map showing a persistent area of snow falling along this trough here. Pretty light up here in the north, but kind of increasing in intensity as you head south there along the southwest coast, Alaska Peninsula with some gusty north winds continuing there, and moderate snow at times, especially on the Bering Sea side of the peninsula there. Rain, Kodiak Island, isolated snow showers here in the south central Bering Sea, then more snow out to the west and dry for the Panhandle, a little gusty in the northeast winds in the inside water channeled areas there. And the high wind warning continues out for tonight for the Alaska Range. That should end tomorrow with more slack gradient and winds coming down. Otherwise, this system here, another one coming onto the map, periods of rain, Kodiak Island, mixed rain and snow, Bristol Bay, northeastern Bristol Bay, into the Alaska Peninsula, but from about west of Chignik, that'll be in the form of snow with snow showers, and a band of snow again extends up along the west coast. And then for Friday, big storm comes into the far western Bering Sea there, bringing storm and gale force winds with it, advancing eastward, not quite making it to Adak, except for maybe some snow late in the day. A break here in the east central Aleutians. Low pressure now moves up into the southeast Bering Sea, just north of the Alaska Peninsula. And again, a trough extending northward has light snow associated with it. Dry in the interior, mostly sunny, south central, southeast interior, North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle there, with this front at least through Friday afternoon staying to the south. Coastal water forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow. East winds 20, gusts 35 knots. Central coast, east winds 20 knots. North coast, east winds 15 knots. Seas up there at about 10 feet. And then for Clarence Strait, north winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Small craft advisories though for Clarence Strait, Stevens Passage north winds at 30 knots and seas at 4 feet, north 20 for Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area. And then for Lynn Canal on Friday, north winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Still have small craft advisories for Stevens Passage for north winds at 25 knots and north at about 15 for Clarence Strait. Small craft advisories now on the south coast of the Panhandle for east winds 25, gusting 40 knots with those higher gusts there off the coast of Prince of Wales Island. Central coast east winds 20 with some higher gusts, and the north coast east winds at 20 knots. Prince William Sound east winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet for tomorrow, and the eastern North Gulf Coast east winds 25 knots, 10-foot seas. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast for east winds at 35 knots. And gales for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay zones, at winds out of the east at 40 knots. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, I've got some gale warnings now for the area south of the Forelands. Northeast at 35 knots, northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 25. No change for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. East winds continue at 40 knots, northeast 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and northeast 20 knots for the eastern coast. Prince William Sound, lightening up winds or lighter winds there, northeast at 10 knots, seas subsiding to 2 feet. And for Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings, east to northeast winds 35 to 40 knots, southeast 25 for Bristol Bay. North winds or north-northwesterlies for the Alaska Peninsula, 15 to 30 knots. And then for Friday, northwest winds here for the Alaska Peninsula at 25 knots. Bristol Bay looking at east winds at 30 knots. And Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds, 30 to 35 knots, with seas here on the east side of the island up to 19 feet. And for Unalaska Island tomorrow, north winds at 30 knots. Over toward Nikolsky, they'll be northeast at 20 knots. And southeast winds 25 knots for Adak and Atka. And then out to the west, we've got west to south winds at 20 to 30 knots. And then with that next big storm coming in, storm warnings coming in from Kiska, or developing here from Kiska to Shimi and Attu for southeast winds, 50 knots, seas building 15 to 18 feet. South winds increasing to 45 knots from Chitka Island in the afternoon. And then for Adak and Atka, south winds at 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 30 knots. And then for the southwest coast tomorrow, brisk wind advisories, north winds at 25 knots, Same thing for the Pribilof Islands, small craft advisories, north winds at 25. East at 15 for St. Matthew Island. Norton Sound, northwest at 15, and north winds 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island. And for Friday, brisk wind advisories, Norton Sound, northeast at 25. And the Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, also looking at northeast winds at 30 knots. Northeast winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. And the Pribilofs, northwest at 30 knots. East winds 30 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for tomorrow, but southwest 15 on the central coast. West side north winds at 10 knots, and the Chukchi Sea north to northwesterlies 15 to 25 knots. And those winds increase on Friday here for the Chukchi Sea. North winds 20 to 30 knots. West winds 15 knots for the remainder of the Arctic coast.